It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in the control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day listeners, and welcome once again to Hard Hats and High Vis, episode 13. We did the election and now we're coming out the other side, talking about all things political, social and cultural in Australia. And joining me today, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. How are you, Jack?
G'day, Jack.
We just want to remind our listeners to this podcast that if you like what you're hearing, give us a solid review on your podcast app, or indeed drop us a line and with any questions you might have. We would love to read out your listeners' letters, and you can drop us a line at the Conditional Release Program at gmail.com, or you can hit me up. My DMs are open on Twitter at Jack the Insider. Well, Jack, Albo did what he said he was going to do, and he's gone off and visited Vladimir Zelensky in Kyiv. Is that a photo opportunity or a genuine show of support?
Oh, probably a bit of both.
He's unveiled, that is Anthony Albanese, has unveiled an extra $100 million in Australian support for the country. That is military aid, military and medical and other forms of economic assistance. And this comes at the same time where Russia has now secured basically all of Donbass all the way to the coast, and they now have that land link between Russia and Crimea. And the war's not going well for Ukraine, is it?
No, it's not. And this is what we've been talking about for some weeks, that on our other program, is that now that Russia are fighting in conditions favourable to them, they will go better.
Yes, well, we talked about, how they like that static war, and we'd also note that parts of Kyiv and elsewhere in the country have been hit by Russian missiles and other projectiles. Prime Minister Albanese has said that Australia would provide an additional 20 Bushmaster protected vehicles and a further 145 armoured personnel carriers to support the country's war effort. I didn't think we had that many, Jack.
I don't know where we're going to get them from.
It has been a major focus of Australia's reasonably large munitions business, that it is all now around APCs, bush rangers, etc. And that's that sort of fast movement in the field stuff that really, I guess, Ukraine really does need as this war goes on.
Less. Now that it's become a more static war, I'm not sure how much use these things are. They're very useful while the Russians are careering across the countryside trying to take the whole thing. But they're less important, I would have thought, when you're getting back to digging in while they lob missiles and artillery at you.
Yes, look, it seems now that Russia will basically just now regroup, and we won't know we don't know what that next step's going to be. That they now have basically secured that land link now between the Black Sea and Crimea all the way through to Russian territory. Unless that you would think, well, many people have thought that was their objective, but it may be much broader than that.
Yeah, well, just generally speaking about Albo on his trip overseas, it just seemed to me that perhaps he was getting caught up in the euphoria of going to a NATO meeting and getting to the G7, etc. At least on the outside.
Well, I think the significant thing there was that NATO, for the very first time, made a statement about China. And while NATO has no bailiwick in the South Pacific, of course, we are seeing more and more sabre rattling from both sides between Australia and China, particularly from one more than the other. And so I think it was important for Albanese to be there for that extent. I mean, obviously hand in hand with the United States.
Yeah, I just didn't think his comments on China or the way he put them was as wise as it could have been.
Yeah, well, what was he saying there? I didn't notice anything that was particularly belligerent.
Well, it was as belligerent as anything that the Australian government said over the last 2 years, and it quickly got a response from the Chinese. And I just don't think that was our role. This was really a NATO argument with China, and not an Australian argument with China. I just thought he looked to me like he was caught up in the euphoria of agreeing with everybody around him.
What, more belligerent than prepare for war? That was Peter Dutton's remark on Anzac Day.
Every bit as.
All right. In an interview yesterday on The Insiders, Senator-elect Pocock was grilled. I suppose grilled might not be the right term, but was questioned about a federal ICAC having the powers to sack members of Parliament. Jack, surely that can't happen.
Grilled was certainly not the right verb to use on this occasion. It was the softest interview I've seen for quite some time. What's the Paul Keating line? Like being beaten with a wet lettuce.
Yeah,
right. Even so, well, it was probably fair enough because he looked like he was a bit nervous on his first game day. David Pocock. Yeah. He did look.
Got to ease him in. Got to ease the new ones in.
Got to ease him in. This arose because Kylie Tink, I think her name is, the new member for North Sydney, suggested that a new ICAC should have the power to sack MPs who it finds have breached some code of conduct, etc.
Well, no one has the power to sack MPs. If a Prime Minister doesn't have the power to sack MPs, the Governor-General, the Queen herself doesn't have the power to sack MPs, Jack.
No, I think we can put in Kylie's first homework package the Constitution of Australia. Have a quick read of that, and see what you can find.
Do you think all these new members should be sat down, given a copy of the Constitution, and ask some questions afterwards, Jack?
Well, if they want to avoid making fools of themselves, this is a good plan. They're free to be as ignorant as they want, But once you get elected, you can be as ignorant as you wish to be.
Yes, that's right.
We have several examples in the past.
Yes, indeed. And we have several examples of Prime Ministers who would have loved to sack some of their own MPs, but just can't do it. They can wander off to the crossbench, but that's about as far as you can go. Craig Kelly comes to mind for Scott Morrison, and Julia Gillard, of course, had the former union boss who was ultimately convicted of fraud. Craig Thompson,
the chap from the Central Coast.
Yes, he's currently experiencing a few additional problems, but she would have loved to have seen him gone, by-election called, and even if you lose it, it's probably better than him being there.
Yeah.
But that's just it. You don't have the power to sack MPs, and an ICAC, as it stands in New South Wales, that's the example that is often used when we're talking about a federal ICAC. It doesn't have to have those powers, of course.
If we're looking for a really useless, terrible ICAC, that would be the one we would use. Yes.
Well, the one that it's the one that's sort of adopted as the bête noire because it's we have all these perp walks and all these sorts of things going on. But it's true to say that the ICAC or the IBAC in Victoria or the Crime and Corruption Commission in WA or the other counterparts across the country don't have the powers to sack MPs. They don't additionally have the powers, for example, to make a minister resign, to resign. So those things are all handled within the political sphere, depending on
which is
what's
where
uncovered.
they should be. they ought to, they lose their job because they lose parliamentary support, or they lose the voters' support. That's how it's supposed to work.
Yes. Look, when we look at some of the New South Wales ICAC's investigations, they made a determination of corruption against a former minister in the state Labor Party, and that fellow is still to be charged, Jack. In fact, it would seem that he's not going to be charged with corruption in high office.
Mm.
Joe,
in part, that's because the definition of corruption in the New South Wales ICAC's fundamentally flawed.
So Joe Tripodi, that's the fellow I was referring to. There were other findings that were against other ministers and members of the Labor Party in New South Wales, in the state parliament, that did basically the process goes. And a finding can be made by an ICAC. It is then referred to a prosecutor, to the DPP in this state, and the DPP determines whether charges are made.
It determines whether it's possible to get a conviction on a crime rather than some made-up version of corruption.
Well, Joe Tripodi, just from that journalist's point of view, Joe Tripodi can be described in reports as corrupt, but he hasn't actually been charged with any offence relating to corruption in public office.
Yes, isn't that an awful situation that the ICAC's left the state in?
I'm not. I don't think you are either. Sort of endorsing Mr. Tripodi, but
no,
yeah,
I've had the dubious pleasure of sitting across the lunch table from Joe.
Yes,
I have no idea whether he's actually corrupt, but if you were casting someone as a sort of a fairly dodgy politician in a TV show, he'd be right up on the top of the list.
You reckon he'd get the casting?
He looks like one. He looks like one. But of course, that doesn't mean much at all.
Well, we can say he's corrupt, Jack, but we don't. But that's without any criminal charges being laid.
Right.
But it didn't force him to resign either. Ultimately, he went. I think probably did force him to resign at some level, but it didn't legally oblige him to resign, and that's
what ended Joe's career.
A bit confused about.
What ended Joe's career was the same thing that got it going. It was the numbers.
Yeah, well, that's the way it probably should work. Yeah, so I think really dumb idea from the Teals. In this case, Collier Tink and Senator-elect Pocock gave it a little bit of oxygen before sort of before stepping aside, didn't he? Or before
he did. He looked a bit nervous and said he didn't. He's not a lawyer, but he didn't think he should. That could there could be some constitutional problems with that. It was all a bit garbled, but he did a pretty fair job, and this is his first outing on the national stage as a politician, so he's allowed to be nervous, and indeed Kylie Tink's allowed to get a few things wrong. This is the joy of a new parliament when we get a whole bunch of new parliamentarians coming in there. A few of them are going to sort of, jump in and say things there that later on they perhaps will think, gee, why on earth did I say that?
Yeah, you'd like to think so. And, of course, they're still at loggerheads with the government over whether, in fact, the Prime Minister, because it's at the Prime Minister's discretion in terms of staffing allocation. And the Teal Independents, as with all the crossbenchers, want their 4 and 4 electoral officers, and 4 personnel or media, advisory staff as well. And Albo said 4 and 1. And I wrote about that last week. And if the comments below the column or anything to go by, there is a resounding support for Anthony Albanese on this.
Yeah, they want twice as many as the party affiliated MPs, and I think that's just ridiculous.
Yeah, we talked about it last week. I think Scott Morrison was saying, "Hey, I'd just like to be your friends, everybody," and gave them a staffing allocation that really is way beyond.
We certainly wouldn't call that a bribe, but gee, if it looks like a duck.
I said it wasn't a bribe. That sounded too ugly. It's more an inducement, which is of course the same thing. So they've got some problems there. There'll be a negotiated solution there. But
I wouldn't call it a bribe or an inducement. I would call it a sweetener.
yeah, well, it was who was it? Lambie, Pocock. Signed this letter, and Pauline and Malcolm Roberts. Very angry letter back to Albanese. Well, it was an open letter, and Anthony Albanese
As you suggested, perhaps jobs had been promised.
Yes, I think that might be the case. A few people might need to be sent home. Well, there you go. So the Indies are going to struggle. It's not just the Teals, it's all the crossbenchers, and they really do have a very, very big opinion of themselves that I don't think's shared shared with them around the country. We had the release of the we had the release of the census data last week, Jack, and now it's coming that we're sort of looking at the census and what it's revealing about our politics. And in the Australian today, it's reported that the census has revealed that the Libs coughed up a lot of wealthy seats. The Liberal Party no longer holds any of the 15 electorates with the highest median personal income, self-reported through the census. There is
a little bit of a distinction between high income and wealth, I might add.
Yeah, it is self-reporting too, Jack. So do we always just add another 20 grand on because we think we're worth it? Anyway, when electorates are ranked by household income, the Liberals have slipped from holding 14 of the top 20 seats prior to the last federal election to now just 5. And we know where a lot of those have gone to the Teals, Kooyong, Goldstein, North Sydney, we just mentioned before, Wentworth, of course, very wealthy area there, Jack, and then
Wentworth is both wealthy and high income, yes, but there is a distinction.
You've got some great stonking buildings on the harbour there, so a lot of asset wealth as well. But this taps into what we've been talking about before the election and after it, that we are seeing wealthier people, the professional class, we might call them, tending to veer progressive in terms of the
high-income people, not necessarily the wealthy people, but the high-income people around the world are tending to embrace progressive politics more and more.
It certainly seems to be the case on the census. I mean, what does the Liberal Party do about that, Jack?
There's not much they can do, nor should they worry too much about it. They should just let that land where it falls.
Are they just going to cough up Wentworth? They're going to cough up?
No, but they'll just go back to what
they've coughed up Warringah now, haven't they? I mean, they basically said they just put the white flag up there, haven't they? They're not going to win Warringah back anytime soon, and that happens. My theory is if you don't win it back straight away, it's gone for as long as that independent member is in the parliament.
Yeah, more or less, yeah. That it's happened before. It's happened to Labor in various parts of the world, various parts of the state, the country as well. And once Ted Mack got hold of North Sydney, he was going to be able to hold that forever.
Yeah, that's right. So
these things happen. What the Liberals have got to do is just to get their house in order and to look at, gee, why did we lose the election? And he's still sitting on the backbench.
I don't think he's taking up an arse groove there, Jack. He's sort of moving around the country. I think he's in Bali at the moment, having a holiday.
Yeah.
Doing
the worst thing the Liberals can do is to do what Labor did in 1996, which is to say we only lost because the people got it wrong. And as long as they don't do that, whatever else they do is probably moving in the right direction.
They've certainly got to have a crack at Kooyong and Goldstein.
Of course they do.
They've really got to have a crack. They can't just cough them up because when you look at there's actually no pendulum in creation at the moment, just because the election's just only been held. But when you look at it, the sort of marginals they can expect to pick up in the next election, it's Lingiari, Chisholm. No, not Chisholm. God, that's no longer marginal. Sorry, the seat on the south coast of New South Wales, where they ran a sort of celebrity candidate, and Lingiari. I mean, that's basically what they've got. So if they cough these things up next time around and lose next time around, it just means that that they need bigger swings to even accommodate the idea of forming a government.
Yeah, well, I don't think they should be even thinking about which seats they're targeting at. What they need to do is to get their house in order and run a good opposition. And the rest of it will take care of itself from there. The results take care of themselves. Get the process right first.
This census analysis said the Liberals lost all 6 of their seats with the highest proportions of renters in Brisbane, Reid, Wentworth, North Sydney, Higgins and Bennelong. Chisholm, Bennelong and Reid, as well as ranking highly for mortgage stress and rentals, also has the highest proportion of Chinese-born voters nationwide. We have talked about this a little bit, and the current leader, of course, was the one who said prepare for war on Anzac Day during the campaign.
I think Albo might have just evened that Chinese problem up this week.
Well, what would Australia? I had a chat with a Chinese-born Australian citizen, a friend of mine, last week, and I said, "Well, what did you think when you heard that remark?" And he says, well, just, it makes you feel very vulnerable in your own country. The idea that we're preparing for war historically would mean possibly the Chinese would be very much second-class citizens, internment camps, all this sort of stuff. Just Dutton just let that go? Does he just go, oh, well, it's just something I said in the heat of the moment, looking for a car-key election, we were looking for any desperate measure we could find. And it's not just a one-off remark from Dutton either.
Like I said, I think Albo's evened that up pretty much this week. In any event, I don't think there's any need for the Liberal Party or Dutton to go back and say, oh, I said that and I shouldn't have. You don't do that. You go forward. Always go forward.
So basically the Chinese community just, they're going to be looking at this guy with an eyebrow raised for a very long time. It's as simple as that. That's where when people talk about the election and
Dutton's probably not going to go from where he is now to being Prime Minister, so that doesn't really matter. What he's got to do is get their house in order and be a decent opposition. That's what works. Get the process right. Don't worry about which seat you're targeting or that seat you're targeting. Get the process right and be a decent opposition. And that's the way back.
So he did say in basically an interview with Simon Benson in The Australian, published this morning, the 4th of July. Happy Independence Day, by the way, Jack. That there would be no prolonged post-mortem. Is he at risk of ignoring what went wrong?
No, I don't think that it takes very long to work out what went wrong. They've been there too long. They were a tired government, and Scott Morrison was proving not to be a good leader or a good Prime Minister towards the end of his career. So I think that you can just put that in the book and say, okay, how do we go about being a good opposition now?
Yeah, well, so you don't think there's any repair work needed to be done, or if it's done, it should be done quietly.
To be done, but you don't do it. You don't do it by going back and saying, "Oh, gee, what if I said this or what if I said that?" What you do is get it right now. So build together, the best opposition team you can. Build the best party structures you can. That means fixing up problems like the Liberal Party's mess in Victoria. Go and do that hard work, the work looking forward, and don't worry too much about what's happened in the past. Parties lose elections all the time.
What about, there's a push on for Liberal women for quotas, Jack. It worked for Labor. You can't say that it didn't. It's always been negated by Liberal Party men in Parliament, that they always thought that quotas were not, you weren't getting the right people, that you should pre-select on merit rather than gender.
Well, that's something they're going to have to fight out amongst themselves. That's up to them.
What do you think about quotas, Jack? Good or bad?
I've never really been a strong supporter of them, but I'll tell you, back in about, it must have been about the early 90s, so perhaps 91 or 92, there was a pre-selection battle for what was a then very safe seat of Melbourne, and Lindsay Tanner was a lead candidate for the left endorsement, and Julia Gillard was as well. And I remember I supported Julia Gillard in that battle because I thought then that Lindsay could probably win just about any seat he stood in that wasn't completely Liberal. Whereas even in 91, 92, I thought it was going to be much harder for a woman to win a marginal seat. And I thought we should give someone who is a rising talent like Julia a chance to win Melbourne.
And Lindsay Tanner didn't talk to you for 20 years.
About 20. We had some kind of arrangement, a political deal. So I walked away from the deal without telling him. So he had every reason to be cross with me. But that's how much things have changed in just 22, that's in 30 years. How much things have changed in 30 years. Conventional wisdom then was it was very hard for women to win marginal seats.
It's now not the same now.
Now we know that's not true.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether it's the quota so much or our realisation that that's the case, that women do make excellent candidates, whether that realisation has led to the increase in numbers rather than just the quotas.
Yeah, very likely. And certainly the Liberal Party's got huge problems there. I mean, when we look across their backbench, they're desultory numbers, barely over 50, and it's heavily male-dominated. And they need to fix it, don't they? Whether it's quotas or just getting around and pre-selecting candidates, women candidates, talented women candidates, they need to address this because it's a bad look. All right. So no long analysis.
And some of their better performers have been their women MPs as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd agree with that. So no prolonged post-mortem for the Liberal Party, or nothing public. I think that's what we're really getting at. You do not want to wash the dirty laundry in public, do you?
There's zero upside in doing that.
Yeah. And it sort of irritates people, particularly people on the left who look at Peter Dutton as if to say, well, maybe they're just not going to learn anything. There is a real prospect that will happen, by the way, that they will have just sort of plotted along and think, look, we'll just go our hardest from the opposition benches and hope like hell that we can win enough seats next time around. And that, to me, is wrong because they clearly have got problems. And some of those, I would imagine, sit very squarely at Peter Dutton's feet. All right. Now, Jack, you may have seen this news. We might not call it an outbreak, but there have been two diagnosed cases of diphtheria in Australia. And this is the first time in, I believe, 40-odd years that this has occurred, because diphtheria is an illness. It can be very, very dangerous for children in particular, but it's been vaccinated for a very, very long period of time. There's a 2-year-old currently in ICU and a 6-year-old it's been explained at close proximity to the family, so maybe not the same nuclear family, but close relatives perhaps, also being treated for diphtheria. Both kids unvaxxed and both from the Northern Rivers, Jack.
Well, that's unsurprising.
It was just unsurprising, wasn't it? When I first read about the diphtheria a case for the little boy, and we really wish him well and hope he beats this. It's going to be tough. He's on assisted breathing, in intensive care, being pumped with a cocktail of chemicals to try and keep him good. And I read that and I thought, diphtheria, my God, it's the diptet. It's the diptet vaccination that's been around for a very long time. And, of course, that surprised me, but what didn't surprise me is that the children were unvaccinated and came from the Northern Rivers part of New South Wales, Jack.
It's a bit like when you read a headline and said, why did someone have a cracker up their clacker? That's going to be from the Northern Territory. Unfortunately,
that's Darwin.
Unfortunately, when you have children who are suffering from preventable childhood diseases, you just think, well, that's Byron Bay,
It is indeed. Now, Byron Shire is a very small shire for a rural shire in New South Wales. It's as big as some of the metropolitan shires in Sydney. But Byron Shire has the lowest rate of childhood vaccination in the state. The highest rate of childhood vaccination is in the outer west region of New South Wales. That is literally back of Burke, where where there's large Indigenous remote communities and so forth. You would think there are enormous logistical problems in getting kids vaccinated, but their vaccination rate is 94% in the outer west region, and in Byron it's 69%. So there's a 25% differential. I mean, how do we fix this? I mean, is there a solution to this? I would think just a simple public information campaign is not going to do it.
No, this is not a peculiarly Australian problem.
No, it's not.
You can in California, they've tracked the low rates of childhood vaccination and the ensuing illnesses, and they geographically track them, and they cluster around Whole Food stores. It's the people who insist upon eating organic food and all that sort of stuff who are the same people who do this.
Yeah, and look, we've covered this in the conditional release program, and so it's sort of whole foods or organic foods are just one sort of trigger, you would think, but it's also this sort of what you might broadly call alternate health, and at the basis of that alternate health is this suspicion about medical science. Suspicion about vaccination, suspicion about Big Pharma. And that's not to say that Big Pharma is perfect in any way, but Jack, you've had your travails with illness, as have I. Have you ever felt the need to rub yourself with crystals or eat a banana with a great big black stain on it?
No, I was actually pretty keen on staying alive, to be quite honest, as I know you were, and I'm not so against Big Pharma because I have to take medication every day to keep everything ticking.
You're providing shareholder value, Jack. That's what you're doing.
And my attitude to surgical procedures is much the same. If the alternative is I'm going to cash in my chips, you get operating there, my man.
It's exactly right. I mean, it's a simple fact, and I'm sure it's the same as you, knowing what you went through. And none of it was perfect. Certainly the same with me. But had I not had surgery, had I gone for a gentle massage and a rubbing of crystals across my body, I'll be dead now.
Neither of us would be making this podcast.
This podcast would be for a very long, silent.
We both had some awful surgery and taken some dreadful medications just to be here. So we're the wrong people to be trying to convince the my body, my choice,
my child's choice. That's the problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the problem.
I've got a bit of respect for my body, my choice, but my child's body, my choice. No,
you do as you're fucking told.
You lose me right there. That we need this not just to protect your child, but to protect the other children in the community.
you'd think there'd be some learning going on. I haven't checked the Telegram pages from various anti-vax groups around the country just yet, but I can predict that they will say that this event was confected by the government or big pharma in order to sort of persuade people to go and vaccinate their children. Look, it is a middle-class problem, and in the States they do say those parents with unvaccinated children are more likely to drive a Prius than a pickup.
Well, that you could take to the bank. That would absolutely be true.
Oh, it is true, and we're seeing
this is a middle class affectation. This is the sort of thing that only the well-to-do worry about.
Indigenous mothers line up to get their children vaccinated.
I've said this before about organic food, that the only two kinds of people who insist upon eating organic food, or who do eat organic food, are the very rich who can afford to, and the poor people who can't afford to put fertiliser on their crops and grow enough to eat.
It's a big problem, and COVID has made it worse, made this more divisive. But we're seeing outbreaks of measles, Jack. Now we knocked measles over in this country in 2012, and now it's back. And we're seeing this. It's an awful transmissible disease. You sit at one end of the MCG, and someone with measles is at the upper end. And if you're not protected against it by vaccine and herd immunity, you can get it. That's how transmissible it is. One of the rare diseases to be aerosol for as long as it is. And we're seeing basically measles come back. We saw through anti-vaxxer movements in New Zealand outbreaks of measles in Samoa, and they're still dealing with it. And it went all the way to Western Australia, where there was an outbreak of measles, childhood measles in Perth. We had this covered, and now we don't. I don't know what you do with these parents.
It's do-gooding middle-class people who cause these problems. We had malaria nearly beaten until the do-gooding middle class said, no, you can't use DDT.
Well, look, they are the ones who are susceptible to the misinformation. There's no doubt about that. But at the very end of this, at the very end of those who spread this misinformation, or who create it in the first place, you've got a whole bunch of people sitting back, selling supplements, making money from this idea that medical science is wrong and that they are right.
I actually don't think they're the cause of it. I just think they're just grifters who are jumping on the bandwagon to take advantage of it. At the core of it is the well-meaning fool, always.
I think that's the spread of it, but you have to understand that this is highly manipulated, Jack. It's some of these people who are selling, and at the what we call the dirty dozen of anti-vaxxers. It includes a Kennedy, son of Bobby, who doesn't sell supplements but still manages to profit from it. The rest of them all do, and it's multi-million-dollar stuff. They are grifters. There's no doubt about that. But they are really...
Yeah, but the core of it is the Bobby Kennedys, the well-meaning fools.
Yeah. Well, it was determined...
Everybody else is just jumping on the bandwagon trying to make a quid where they can. But that's the core of it. The supplement sellers, of which Kennedy profited from as well, they were determined, with Kennedy, they were determined to provide the world with about 3/4 of the misinformation about vaccinations that's spread around the world. And it's become a massive problem, Byron. Yeah, but they're not the core. That's not where it starts.
That's the cause. That's the cause.
No, it starts with the well-meaning fool who gets it going.
No, it ends with the well-meaning fool who's decided that they're on a new diet and they just want to start yoga classes, and their yoga instructor is wearing a swastika and talking about how Vladimir Putin's a terrific bloke.
Anyway, we're not going to agree on where it starts.
And I just think this problem's become unsolvable.
Tell me about the floods in Sydney, because I was pretty sure that the floods were going to stop as soon as we got rid of Scott Morrison.
Well, this is the third. I think this is.
I watch the ABC and read the Fairfax Press, and I was absolutely certain that Scott Morrison was causing all those.
Well, this is the third once every 1,000-year event, Jack, just this year. Once every 1,000 years. That's what some idiots basically call it. Around my part of the world, we're expecting Bowral to be flooded today. Roads closed. There are roads closed throughout New South Wales. The rivers that run around Sydney and into it are all flooding. They're all basically at peak levels anyway. It's topped up with the worst of the rain came between Sydney and Wollongong in that strip there that I'm a sort of part of in a way, where Shell Harbour had I think it was 280 millimetres of rain in 24 hours. Most of that can get out of the coastal areas, but it's sort of soul destroying because I can't imagine what's going on in Lockyer Valley. I believe Queensland was spared what was predicted to be pretty rough conditions rain wise over the weekend, but I know it wasn't so bad in Queensland. But really, from around Port Stephens all the way down to Bateman's Bay in New South Wales, coastal and inland there, it's just been steady rain. It hasn't been as heavy as the last two flooding events, but it's just been steady rain. Here we've had 180 millimetres, or we had 180 millimetres on Saturday. So the question is, when's it going to end? And
well, it'll end when the weather pattern turns around, like it always does.
Well, I was listening to the Bureau of Meteorology, who are saying that La Nina, which is the cause for a very large degree of all of this, is starting to break down and will over the next month or two. And that can only be a good thing. I mean, we did have probably about, it was almost like the John Howard 10 minutes of economic sunshine. We had about 3 weeks of reasonably good weather in and around Greater Sydney and outside of it. And now it's gone hell again. And you've got to worry about farmers who have planted another crop, because certainly in the Lockyer Valley, which is one of the great food bowls of the country, they planted once, they got flooded, they planted again, they got flooded again. And that's the reason why lettuce, an iceberg lettuce would cost you $10 a head at the moment. It's contributing, in no small way to inflation in the country, and that will be the case now. And it's across the board. It's not just iceberg lettuce. I mean, a head of broccoli will cost you just around about $10 a kilo at the moment. All of this stuff is because some of the food bowl areas, particularly around Lockyer Valley, were absolutely smashed by floods. And now we've just got people being pulled out of their homes. We're on a sort of vague alert. I haven't even got the text message, but we're on a sort of vague alert and told to keep an eye out for road flooding. Which will almost certainly be happening. I was going to go down to Bowral later today and see how bad it is. But yes, hopefully this will be the end of it, Jack. That La Nina is starting to break down, according to the Bureau of Meteorology, and that so we know it's a strengthening of trade winds easterly through the tropics, and because those easterly winds are stronger, it means more moisture is blown from the Pacific towards Australia. So we get a lot of these coastal events.
I can certainly remember as a young bloke working in rural Victoria, there was a few winters in a row there where we got flooded just about every year. You got used to driving to work through the water. These things happen.
Yeah, look, they do. But it has ceased to be funny some time ago, Jack. It is no longer amusing at all, and really worry about people, particularly in low-lying areas around the river systems. People in places like Windsor, Campbelltown, Menangle, Jack, where the trots are. They won't be having too many trots. They won't be having the harness racing for a little while here, because that's about 2 metres underwater at the moment. So yes, we're just hanging in there, Jack.
Keep your feet dry.
Yeah, well, yes, it's not so easy. I have pets who just keep looking at the doors and just going, it's still raining. It's still raining. They're very depressed. They're very down. They can't run out. One of the little cats just bolted outside. There was just a brief break in the rain, bolted around the place, and then ran back inside. And then looked out again. It was raining again. Yeah, so we wish for the best for all Sydney-siders in the Greater Sydney region, and hope that you do not have to go through the appalling business of having your houses flooded out.
I can remember when I was years ago. I was at school in Echuca, and a mate had a little fox terrier, and he had it since it was a pup, and it was one of those, not the La Nina patterns. It was the dry patterns. It hadn't rained for a couple of years.
El Nino.
An El Nino. And when it finally started to rain, the poor little fella, he didn't know what to do, because he was used to being sprayed by the hose, and he knew that if you ran away from it, you got out of it. But when it was raining, there was nowhere to go. He was very confused for a day or so.
Droughts and flooding rains in this country, mate. They're very little in between in recent years. I mean, just, crikey, 3 years ago, this place was a pall of ash and smoke, and we're on constant fire alert. So that's what it's like to live in Eastern Australia at the moment.
Has anybody asked Tim Flannery for a comment?
Well, Tim did predict that there would be drought, no flooding rain for a very long time. If ever, never again.
Not even the rains that fall will fill the dams.
Well, the dams are more than full, Jack. having a crack them open just to stop them from flooding. So yes, it's been extraordinary. I've never seen anything quite like it in terms of not just one event. I've been in floods before, and Melbourne had some shocking floods, and Brisbane has had a long history.
Brisbane has them regularly, yeah.
Oh, they sort of got it solved, but not real. But here you've had one major event, then two, and then three. So yeah, it's been pretty hard to take. We don't want to see any rain for a couple of months after this one. We're supposed to get it's clearing up on Tuesday and then rain again on Wednesday.
What was the telegram from the journalist from Venice during World War II? Water everywhere, not a drop to drink.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to drink that. In the last floods, we saw Mitchell Robinson. This was the Brisbane Lions utility Jack. He was having a swim around his backyard, and I said, "Mate, don't do that. That's open sewerage, you idiot." You know, but he's got the bathers on. He thought it was terrific. But that's Mitch for you. And in the media, Jack, Leigh Sales retired. It was her last show on Thursday, and I think they did a special on the Friday in the ABC. And I think it's
my first reaction was that the farewell show was just a little bit overindulgent. I've got to say.
Well, they're going to be.
I'm a Leigh Sales fan, but I thought that was a bit.
They're going to be a bit that way, aren't they? There's going to be tributes aplenty, and not a dry eye in the house, and all that sort of stuff. Now, Sales is retired. I can tell you. Because I'm a mate of hers. And she's retired because she wants to literally spend more time with her family. You've got two young boys. And this
is fair income this time.
This is fair income, yeah. So it's not just...
This is not the politician who's retiring to spend more time with his family.
But she did... I mean, she just wants to spend more time with her boys who are getting older now and school age and they miss their mum because hosting a show like that, you know, it takes a lot of time. But she was pilloried on Twitter, and I used to watch it and just used to really annoy me because there was this there were shrieks from the left. Most of them came from the left that she'd given Scott Morrison or a Liberal minister a soft run, and at the same time you'd look at people from the right and they would say that she was, you know, attacking that particular person, whether it was Scott Morrison or whoever it was, attacking that person unfairly. I mean, you just can't win this.
I used to follow her Twitter account, and I got to say, almost all of this came from the left.
Oh, most of it, well, because Twitter is a left-wing platform.
Twitter is
But
mainly.
I used to
watch.
I used to watch it come from both sides on the same day, on the same interview, Jack, that she was accused of being biased from the left, and we know that sort of stood up a fair bit. That was the criticism du jour on Twitter. But you'd see it in the same interview. She was accused by the right of being left biased, and then she was accused by the propensity of left people on Twitter of being right wing biased. I mean, she literally can't win.
That's because, particularly the left on Twitter, thinks that the media ought to be a barracking vehicle.
That's absolutely right, and they think that an interview should at least involve, on one occasion at least, where the interviewer leaps up from a chair and just goes to the throat of the interview subject. That's the way an interview should be conducted. But I actually didn't ever see or perceive myself that there was bias in Sales's question. Not once. And that's not because I'm a mate. I look at these things objectively. But you just didn't see it. And this is because bias is a very subjective thing. Bias is, like beauty in only one respect. It's in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
Isn't it? No, that's what it is. Because if you look at this thing, it's a subjective process. It's a subjective criticism that says, I don't like that particular question. Now, I'll take one example. So Salesy was saying on election night, she had Tanya Plibersek on the panel, and she said to Tanya, what's gone wrong for Labor tonight? The question might have been prefaced with your vote's down, you may not form majority government. In fact, on that evening, it wasn't looking all that great. And she said, so what went wrong for Labor? Labor obviously won the election and the coalition were belted, but at the same time, it was like she was basically pilloried for asking a question that quite rightly pointed out to Labor's very low primary vote.
Yeah. What about a situation where Kerry O'Brien says we lost seats, or when Pats Cavalis was talking about Western Australia, saying, "Well, we're going really well."
Did she do that?
Is that bias in the eye of the beholder?
I didn't see. I know Patricia quite well. I haven't spoken to her for years, but did she actually do that?
Oh yes, she was caught up on election night. She was covering the election from the ALP function, and I suspect she was caught up in the emotion of it all. They were finally winning.
She might have had a few wines, mate.
Yeah, she could well have. One thing I really enjoy about Twitter, it has belled the cat on the ABC personalities, because you can get on Twitter and spend an hour or so looking at their individual Twitter accounts, and you can see one of the problems with the ABC is that there's an astonishing consistency of views right across a range of topics. There's almost no diversity of views in their personal Twitter accounts. So that's not bias. That's just dullness.
Yeah, it can be a bit dull.
Which is why the Insiders has become almost unwatchable, except when you're on it.
Except when I'm on it, of course. Yeah. That's right. But in the case of Leigh, I really didn't ever see it, and I don't think she actually showed it. She was pilloried again for having a lunch with Malcolm Turnbull. I think she got on pretty well with Malcolm, but there's nothing wrong with that.
People of opposing views quite often. This will be a surprise to some of the left wing and right wing lunatics on Twitter. But sometimes people with opposing political views can get on quite well.
Exactly. I've never.
If you
asked me who Salesy voted for, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I wouldn't know. And I've never had that
I,
discussion with her, nor would I.
unlike you, I've never met Leigh Sales, but I think she has been one of the best political interviewers and journalists in the country for quite a long time. And I'm sorry to see her leaving 7:30 Report. I don't have quite as much confidence in Sarah Ferguson. But
Is Sarah doing it, or is it Laura?
I understand Sarah Ferguson's going to be heading the program, but I might be wrong.
Okay. All right. I did not know that. Yeah. But anyway, we wish Leigh well in retirement. I believe there's some talk of her taking on a sort of interview-based program.
I'm sure whatever she does next, she'll be excellent at. She's very talented.
But good on her. She's one of our better interviewers going forward. I mean, if you wanted to watch a punch-up, you'd probably go Red Kerry. But if you wanted a pretty objective analysis of what was going on, or the main subject of the interview, then Leigh was as good as it got.
And there's one thing we should all take away from this: Twitter bears no resemblance to real life.
It probably does around an ABC audience. I think that's one thing I learnt from all of that. That we are talking about a lot of ABC viewers on Twitter, Jack.
Yeah, well, if that's their audience, they've got a problem.
You'd be unable to satisfy them. That's the thing. You simply won't be able to satisfy them.
If Twitter does reflect the ABC audience, then the ABC has a problem. They need more diversity in their audience.
All right. Now, speaking of diversity, Jack, the Collingwood Football Club, well, they're not diverse at all, are they? In fact, I think that's one of the problems with them. But they're in the 8, and they're coming. And so are Richmond. And Richmond are probably a bigger threat to some of the sides already in the 8, including my beloved Blues. But Collingwood now, they're pretty much there. You would think that they're going to make the finals this year, which is an astonishing achievement, really, from the new coach. New administration, of course. Eddie Maguire gone, but the former Brisbane player, what's his name? McRae. He's done
Flea McRae, they used to call him.
Flea, yeah, and he's basically done a hell of a good job. And you can see a very calm visage there when he's coaching them. They look like they'll make the finals almost certainly. Why do people who don't barrack for Collingwood hate them so much, Jack? I know I do.
Well, I think historically they were the big club.
They still are, I think. I think it might be in terms of membership, if you want to use that as a guide. I think Richmond probably just edged them out in terms of in numbers of members, but that's coming off 3 flags in 4 years for Richmond. But historically, you're going back to the Jack Wren days, aren't you, or John Wren days?
Well, even when I was a young kid, Collingwood had 11,000 members, and no one else had more than about 4 or 5.
Yeah.
So they were double the size, and therefore had a bit to spend. Not they ever spent much. They had that dreadful ground at Victoria Park.
Just awful.
They certainly didn't spend much on facilities.
No, if you're an opposition player, you would be having a cold shower at Vic Park.
Yeah. But they were big and they were arrogant, which meant they got hell of a lot of support. No one ever likes the big club. How many kids all around the world will support someone else rather than Manchester United?
Look, I grew up in their zone, and so we would have Collingwood footballers come to the school and do the development stuff, and obviously with that, every other kid in school either barracked for Collingwood, sometimes Fitzroy. You'd have a weirdo every now and then turn up, barrack for Geelong, St Kilda or something like that. But there weren't that many Carlton supporters, and we weren't that far away from Carlton. But yeah, Collingwood just sort of dominated. And I got to know some of their footballers later in life, and we got to know the wonderful Dennis Banks, and you realise, gee, I hated you when you were playing, but you're actually a really nice bloke. Got to know quite a few of them, the Richardson brothers and so forth, and Leigh Adamson, of course. I played a lot of cricket with Leigh Adamson, who was a wonderful halfback at Collingwood for a very long time, played through the 60s and 70s. They had the stuffing kicked out of them, the arrogance kicked out of them since, from 58. They didn't win one till crikey, when was it?
1990, I can tell you the date.
Yeah, 1990 it was too, yeah. When they
The
beat
first
the
week
Bombers.
in October 1990.
Didn't just beat the Bombers, mate. Gave them a flogging as well at quarter time. Well, most of them did. Yes, it's a really funny one. I still can't get out of that mode. I was watching them play. Over the weekend, and I thought, oh, gee, they should have won that game, and they did. But it was for a moment there. I couldn't stop barracking for the opposition. And that's the way it goes. It doesn't really matter. I was actually looking at it thinking, this doesn't impact my side too much. Doesn't really. I just want Collingwood beaten every time they hit the ground.
Yeah, I've kind of lost that a bit. I've got to say, I probably grew up with that, but I've long since lost it.
Yeah, it's a great shame. When you meet a few Collingwood footballers, they tend to be pretty decent blokes. Anyway, Jack, in Wimbledon's on at the moment, and our great, probably our highest seeded Australian in the event, Nick Kyrgios, is causing a few problems.
Well, he sort of is, isn't he? He's sort of making a bit of a dick of himself, really.
Janet Braxton reckons he needs to be basically banned from the sport. I think that's a bit much.
Well, I'm never a much of a one for banning people from things, and I certainly wouldn't support that. I think it's
you're an essence supporter. I mean, that old club should have been banned a few years ago for their supplements program, but you let them off.
Yeah, well, I could, as you know, I would have. I think they got off pretty lightly in the end. I thought the inquiry was very, very, very poorly handled. In all sorts of ways. No, I don't think people should be banned from the sport. I think the officials in charge of the tournament need to be strong where it's appropriate. I've got no problem at all with a tournament referee coming out and saying, you're defaulting, we're defaulting you out of this match. I've got no objection to that if the behaviour becomes too unruly.
It hasn't been that bad, though, has it?
No,
he was called a bully
by
a bloke he beat in the first round, or first or second round, I think, and he said that the bloke had a bit of evil. He's got an evil side to him. Ooh.
Oh, well, I suppose we all do. Is the
Not
evil?
I thought that was a bit much.
Look! It's just a difficult thing with individual sports. You get a bloke who's got a ton of ability. I mean, what he is an underachiever in his sport. Really, he's 26 and hasn't really won anything much.
He hasn't won. He hasn't won a Grand Slam tournament.
No, and hasn't really looked like winning a Grand Slam.
I suppose he plays in the age where it's basically between three players who win those Grand Slams because they're just that little bit better than everybody else.
But he hasn't got to a final, So
yeah.
So he's got plenty of ability.
Won the doubles, won the Australian Open doubles, but yeah,
he's an underachiever on any assessment. This can happen particularly in individual sports. In team sports, a bloke like that normally gets sorted out by his teammates.
Jordan De Goey had a week off.
And they'll put up with a hell of a lot provided you're good. But even then, they're going to demand some things of you. And that doesn't happen in individual sports, particularly in tennis.
Well, in a sport that's flush with money and the players are walking around earning big heaps just for winning second round games and so forth, the idea of fining players is a bit silly.
It's a waste of time.
It's a bit silly.
Absolute waste of time.
And that's what Nick, and he's not the only one, of course, that, players misbehave. And that is another part of that individual sport, that there's this great sort of focus on them. So not just Nick, but any player in the ATP, they've got a small army of yes people, biomechanics guys, fitness people, dietitians, etc., and just one or two people just to come along and pat them on the back. And I think that alone can drive some pretty ordinary behaviour amongst people.
Yeah, whether it's not just sport, whether it's people, actors, and who work in
Yeah.
movies, musicians, whatever. You get a
One or
lot
two
of yes.
politicians, Jack, I can think of.
Politicians, same thing. You get a lot of yes people around them, and that can encourage some very ordinary behaviour.
Yeah, might explain a
One
little bit
interesting-
around
one-
about the
one
most
interesting
recent federal election in this country too.
One
Yeah.
interesting thing is Johnny McEnroe said that if he was going to coach anyone, this is a little while ago, if he was going to coach anyone on the tour, he'd want to coach Kyrgios because he thought he had the most ability. That might be the solution. Someone like John McEnroe coaching him might just.
Of course,
be the answer.
we said all those things about John McEnroe, or those things were all said about John McEnroe in his heyday, and he was just a beautiful player, wasn't he? He used to get a little bit upset, and that was probably part of that whole business of just promotion of the individual above the collective, which tennis does. But hell of a good player and very good analyst of the sport to this day.
He did, but in the end, what he did was he made use of his talents. That's what Nick Kyrgios is not doing, but that's up to him.
Yeah, indeed. All right. Thank you very much.
Janet, you're wrong. He shouldn't be.
Stop banning people. God,
no,
what are you
no,
from?
no.
What are you from? The Greens, Janet? They're into banning people. Yes, I want to ban this and ban that. All right. Look, thank you very much, Jack, for your time today on hard hats and high vis. And we just want to remind listeners, if anything here has caught your fancy and you want to drop us a line, please do to the conditional release program. It's got a "the" in front of it, the conditional release program at gmail.com, or hit me up on Twitter at Jack the Insider, and my DMs are always open. And we look forward to coming back with you next week and giving you hard hats and high vis number 14. This is 13 done and dusted. See you, Jack.
Cheers, mate.
All the best.